perpetrator's narrative. At the time, I had good reasons for doing it. Perhaps I was responding to an immediate provocation, or I was just reacting to the situation in a way that any reasonable person would. I had a perfect right to do what I did, and it's unfair to blame me for it. The harm was minor and easily repaired, and I apologized. It's time to get over it and put it behind us. Let bygones be bygones. Okay, Baumeister got these narratives from interviewing dozens or even hundreds, I forget the number, of criminals on death row. These are serial killers, murderers, and so the baddest of the badasses in jail. And he just asked them, why'd you do it? And so they actually, had narratives that sounded something like this. Some examples from Roy's book, 1994, Police Record of a Spree Killer. Other than the 2 we killed, the 2 we wounded, the woman we pistol whipped, and the light bulbs we stuck in people's mouths, we didn't really hurt anybody. Oh, okay. Or John Wayne Gacy after killing 33 boys. I see myself more as a victim than as a perpetrator. I was cheated out of my childhood. Baumeister thinks it's a deep feeling that these people had. They think they did the right thing, a moral thing. That's Pinker's point, that there's too much moralization, not that we have a shortage of it. So there's the point of view of the victim versus the point of view of the perpetrator, and then there's the point of view of the scientist studying it. And unfortunately, the point of view of the scientist studying evil is that of the perpetrator. That is, we know how the victims feel about it. Of course they feel that way. Everybody would feel that way. But what does the perpetrator think? To understand why perpetrators perpetrate violence and evil, we have to look at it from a detached, amoral, contextual situation so that evil is explicable. In other words, the point of view of the victim is the point of view of the moralizer. The point of view of the scientist is the point of view of the perpetrator. So, for example, take the victim's perspective versus the perpetrator's perspective in the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of vicious pogroms against Jewish communities that were part of a long history of European anti-Semitism. Or, the Crusades were a brutal invasion of Muslim lands and the start of a long history of humiliation of Islam by Christendom. Or how about that difference in the American Civil War? The American Civil War was necessary to abolish the evil institution of slavery and preserve a nation conceived in liberty and equality. That's certainly the perspective most of us take now. Here's the point of view from the South. The American Civil War was a power grab by a centralized tyranny intended to destroy the way of life of the traditional South. Now, most Southerners don't think like that today, but they certainly did for close to a century after the American Civil War. Or try to see it from Hitler's point of view. What? That's insane. Well, he did have a point of view. And if we're not going to understand Hitler and the Nazis, if we don't take their perspective and think, what were they thinking? And it all goes back to the First World War, the ending of it, and the stab in the back conspiracy theory that the Jews, made the German government, concede victory and sue for peace and so on. And, of course, it ends up in utter ruin by 1945. But that's the only way to understand the Nazis and Hitler, is to delve deep into their thinking. Why did they do this from their perspective? It starts with the belt buckle that the SS soldiers wore. Gott Mit Uns, God is with us. Okay, so this idea that they're all a bunch of atheists and that's why they committed evil. No, they weren't atheists. Point of view of the victim versus that of the perpetrator. Here's an additional problem. The myth of pure evil is the point of view of the victim. That is, evil is intentional and gratuitous infliction of harm for its own sake, perpetrated by a villain who is malevolent to the bone, inflicted on a victim who is innocent and good. And evil is mostly perpetrated by ordinary people in unordinary circumstances that is rationalized in that sense. I like this quote from Lewis Fry Richardson, a meteorologist who later in his life took up the study of war. So he's kind of explaining why he's doing this. Because most people just moralize about war. It's bad. And as he writes, for indignation is so easy and satisfying a mood that it is apt to prevent one from attending to any facts that oppose it. If the reader should object that I have abandoned ethics for the false doctrine that to understand all is to forgive all, I can reply that it is only a temporary suspense of ethical judgment made because to condemn much is to understand little. Again, so the point of this lecture and my books on this subject is that we want to understand the cause of evil, the nature and cause of evil and violence and why bad things happen, not condemn it. We can agree to condemn it, but that's not going to help us understand it. Try taking the perspective of Eichmann and Heydrich. This is Adolf Eichmann on the right and Heydrich on the left here, who is orchestrating the final solution at this very building here. This is at Wannsee, suburb of Berlin, where the Wannsee Conference was held in January of 42, where they kind of orchestrated the final solution to the Jewish question, that is the Holocaust. Eichmann wrote in his memoirs, in his diary, I remember that at the end of this Wannsee Conference, Heydrich, Mueller, and my humble self settled down comfortably by the fireplace, and that then for the first time I saw Heydrich smoke a cigar or a cigarette. And I was thinking, today Heydrich is smoking, something I have not seen before. And he drinks cognac, since I had not seen Heydrich take any alcoholic drink in years. After this Wannsee Conference, we were sitting together peacefully, and not in order to talk shop, but in order to relax after long hours of strain. Sounds like a couple of guys at a corporate conference having a drink afterwards after a long day of work, but that's how they treated it. Or take this letter from SS Obersturmführer Karl Kretschmer from this book by Ernst Klee and his colleagues, The Good Old Days, the Holocaust is seen by its perpetrators and bystanders. Okay, so we have a lot of literature by the victims. What we don't have much literature on is by the perpetrators. What were they thinking when they were committing these acts of violence against Jews? Here is one. This guy, okay, he's writing a letter to his wife. Sunday, September 27th, 1942. My dear Soska, I'd like to be with you all. What you see here makes you either brutal or sentimental. As the war is, in our opinion, a Jewish war, the Jews are the first to feel it. Here in Russia, wherever the German soldier is, no Jew remains. You can imagine that at first I needed some time to get to grips with this. There's no room for pity of any kind. You women and children back home could not expect any mercy or pity if the enemy got the upper hand. This is what they were doing. Now, at first, it was hard to get these soldiers to do this close range. Blood and brains would splatter all over their uniforms, and they felt disgust about it. I mean, the average person does not want to do this. They have to be trained to do this. But with rifles at a distance, that helps. Even better, gas chambers, and so forth. So, that again tells us something about human morality in the brain. He continues on another letter to his wife, October 19th, 1942. If it weren't for the stupid thoughts about what we are doing in this country, the Einsatz here would be wonderful. The Einsatzgruppen were the special action forces that followed the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union and wiped out, killed all the Jews and Roma, homosexuals, and so forth. Anybody they didn't want. Door to door. Anyway, he said he's basically telling his wife, it would be great here, except for this other thing we have to do, since it's put me in a position where I can support you all very well. Since I consider the last Einsatz to be justified, and indeed approve of the consequences it had, the phrase, stupid thoughts, is not strictly accurate. Rather, it is a weakness not to be able to stay on the side of dead people. The best way of overcoming it is to do it more often than it becomes a habit. Okay, so this is a little clue into the psychology of evil. If you do it enough, you get used to it. And then the normal repulsive emotions we have about violently killing other people go away. Here I'm talking about people you don't even know, people that haven't done anything to you. You just walk into a town and start killing people.
The reason for fighting I never did get, but I learned to accept it and accept Germans now too have God on their side. And now we got weapons of the chemical dust. If fire them we're forced to, and fire them we must. One push of the button, we've shot the world wide. And you never ask questions when God's on your side. For many long years I've thought about this, and now as I'm leaving, I'm weary as hell. The confusion I'm feeling, no tongue can tell. The words fill my head, and they fall to the floor. If God is on our side, He'll stop the next war.
Okay, another good example of this comes from a tape recording we have of Heinrich Himmler's speech he gave at Poznan in Poland, in which he's encouraging his SS generals and colonels to step up to the plate and get with the program of killing more Jews. And so here's just a short excerpt from that.
Ik wil ook een ganz schwieriges Kapitel. Will ich hier vor allem Zeit nehmen. Es soll uns auch sein, trotzdem werden wir nicht öffentliche Öffentlichkeit nie darüber reden. Genauso wenig wie wir am 30. Juni gezögert haben,
Okay, here he's referring to June 30th, 1934, the Night of the Long Knives, when they killed their own people, not just German citizens, although they do that too, but their fellow Nazis who they felt were competing for power and not towing the line, the new direction that the Nazi Party had moved into, and so on. And so he's encouraging them, look, we did that. If we can kill our own fellow German Nazis, we should be able to do this. Okay, so about which we have never spoken and never will speak. So they do know this is wrong. These are war crimes, what we would later call war crimes. So this is why they tended not to put these sorts of things in writing.
Es gehört zunächst mal, wie man leicht ausspricht. Was wie heute ausgehört. Fast in jeder Partei. Das Gas, Programm,
So here, by the way, in terms of responding to the Holocaust deniers or revisionists, he's telling us right here what everybody knows. And we have this on tape. You can hear him saying it himself. You know, the Ausrotten der Juden, that's it. But now he's going to get to a complaint that everybody knows we're doing this. It's a good thing to do, but everybody has an exception. Somebody they know. Usually that's the case. Somebody you know, that's a good Jew, or somebody who works for you that's Jewish, or your doctor is Jewish, or your lawyer is Jewish, or your housekeeper is Jewish, or whatever. And all of them felt like, well, we don't want to exterminate this person because I know this person. They're a good person. Again, a little hint of the psychology of evil. It's harder to commit evil against people you know.
Und dann kommen sie alle die braven Millionen, und der Schluss, der kann nicht und so gesehen, ist gestorben hat keiner. Von euch werden die meisten wissen, was es heißt, der Fleisch bei Samini. 500 Taling oder 1000 Taling. Und bis durchgehalten zu haben. Und dabei abgesehen von menschlichen Ausnahmeschwächen. Anständig zu sein.
So here, in a way, he's saying is that the more people we kill, the easier it gets. It's hard to kill one person if they're right there in front of you, but if you have 100 or 1,000 and we get used to it, it's kind of the opposite of the adopt a child. One face, one person I care about, but 100, 500 I don't care about. It's the same principle, but in the with the reverse emotional valence. Okay, that's enough of Heinrich Himmler's speech. It goes a long ways to explaining what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. This is she was reporting from Jerusalem of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who had been absconded from South America and hauled back to Israel and put on trial as a war crime, as a war criminal. And Hannah Arendt was reporting, I think it was for the Atlantic, just journal articles. So then she wrote it up into a book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And here's the idea that you think you're going to see this evil guy, and instead you get this kind of squirmy looking bureaucrat, thick glass bureaucrat. Here's how Baumeister puts it. The essential shock of banality is the disproportion between the person and the crime. The mind reels with the enormity of what this person has done, and so the mind expects to reel with the force of the perpetrator's presence and personality. When it does not, it is surprised. Yet the magnitude gap provides one explanation for the surprise and disappointment at evil's banality. The enormity of the crime is apparent from the victim's perspective, but often to the perpetrator, it was far less enormous. It might seem quite fitting and appropriate to be a rather ordinary, banal person if the crime is viewed from the perpetrator's perspective. Okay, so that helps us see what they were thinking. Eichmann, he just thought himself as a bureaucrat. Or take Maximilian Grabner, the head of the political department at Auschwitz and associate of the camp commander, Rudolf Hirsch. So that's Grabner on the left there, and then Rudolf Hirsch, the commandant, on the right. I only took part in this crime because there was nothing I could do to change anything. The blame for this crime lay with National Socialism. I myself was never a National Socialist. Okay, they all said this, which was bullshit. But nevertheless, I still had to join the party. I only took part in the murder out of consideration for my family. I was never an anti-Semite and would still claim today that every person has the right to live. Okay, this is just after the fact, hindsight, bias, rationalization. Of course, most of them knew what they were doing, and anti-Semitism was rampant at the time. Although I've now come to the conclusion that no Hitler, no Holocaust. In fact, no Hitler, no World War II. I think it's another lecture, but I think the case can be made for that. Not that these people weren't anti-Semitic. They were. Most Americans were anti-Semitic. Maybe not to the extent that Europeans were. Not just Germans, but Poles as well, and French and so on. Italians, Greeks, and so on. Anti-Semitism was quite rampant in Europe at that time, but not exterminationism. That was a uniquely Nazi, particularly Hitlerian ideology.
This is a great book, Blitzed, Drugs in Nazi Germany. the sensational German bestseller on the overwhelming role of drug taking in the Third Reich, from Hitler to housewives. The Nazis presented themselves as warriors against moral degeneracy, yet, as Norman Ohler's gripping bestseller reveals, the entire Third Reich was permeated with drugs. Cocaine, heroin, morphine, and, most of all, methamphetamines, or crystal meth, used by everyone from factory workers to housewives, and crucial to troops' resilience, even partly explaining German victory in 1940. The promiscuous use of drugs at the very highest levels also impaired and confused decision-making, with Hitler and his entourage taking refuge in potentially lethal cocktails and stimulants administered by the physician Dr Morell as the war turned against Germany. While drugs cannot on their own explain the events of the Second World War or its outcome, Ohler shows they change our understanding of it. Blitzed forms a crucial missing piece of history. There's an interesting piece of historical detective work by German journalist Norman Ohler. He's uncovered the sheer extent of drug use by the National Socialist regime in Germany. From about 1941, Hitler was high as a kite on a cocktail of drugs. And this helps explain his euphoria and irrationality. The Nazis used them militarily too. The Wehrmacht was issued 35 million crystal meth tablets before the attack on France and the Low Countries. The Allies were expecting them to come by the same route as World War I. They didn't. They came through the Ardennes. That should have tired them out, but it didn't. They just didn't need to sleep. When they tried the same thing in Russia, it didn't work, of course, because that's a tactic that'll become counterproductive in the long term.
On the 17th of January 1940, a meeting took place between Hitler, General Erich von Manstein, and the commander of a panzer division, Erwin Rommel. They discussed plans to push through the Ardennes and invade France. Hitler was attracted to the surprise attack and agreed to the proposition.
When one looks at the Blitzkrieg through the Ardennes, Guderian said to his troops, "I expect you to go without sleep for 3 days." Now, 3 days in a tank in an armoured fighting vehicle during the early days of summer, but it happened to be extremely hot, would have tested anyone's resilience. Drugs, therefore, seen as legitimate and legitimised by the regime, were a very good source of energy and stimulus during a very difficult period.
For this push to be successful, the army would have to drive for days without stopping and without sleeping.
Now, Perpetrator, well, that's a miracle drug, because what that means is our guys don't have to rest. They can just keep going. They can do a forced march through the Ardennes forest for 3 days and just keep going. They don't need to sleep. What an advantage that is, because if speed of manoeuvre is what it's all about, speed and your ability to keep going are absolutely crucial elements of what you're trying to achieve.
On the 10th of May 1940, Perpetrator was taken in the millions. German propaganda often depicted Germany as quick victory due to the morale of the National Socialists, but in reality, Panzer Troop unit drivers were taking 2 to 5 permeated tablets a day to ensure they didn't sleep and they didn't stop.
Berlin was very cheap in the 20s. The economy was very bad. The state was not very strong. Germany had lost the First World War.
One also saw a reaction, really, against the defeat. They were trying to escape it, and that's why drugs played such a large part.
Life in Germany after the end of the First World War was incredibly difficult initially, and that's in those first years, that's when you've got kind of wheelbarrows of cash, hyperinflation, massive unemployment and a lot of civil unrest as well. But as the 20s develop, and so Germany starts to get itself back on the tracks again.
There was a feeling of uncertainty, but also a sense of anything is possible, a sense of let's experiment, let's try out new things politically, culturally, socially. So especially in Berlin, it was a very open and free time.
This is where they were having these incredible nightclubs and cabarets and so on. This was a place where you could have free love, you could take drugs, you could drink as much as you like, you could take heroin, basically do anything you wanted.
So I guess Berlin acquired its own kind of flavor, or at least reputation, for being sexually open, promiscuous place where anything goes.
And that decadency led to great military inspiration, but also great political and social change.
Halt! Alle Männer!